Welcome everyone to the IOSH Logistics and Retail Group webinar. I am Ria Stepnine, Communications Coordinator, and today we will be discussing aggression and violence in the retail industry, as well as its legal implications for employees and the effects on victims. Leading this discussion today, we have Mr. Alastair Schuberth, Risk Partner at Marsh. Over to you, Alastair.
Thank you, Ria. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for the introduction. I'll just share my screen so that you can see the slide. So my name is Alistair Schuberth. As I said, I'm a risk partner at Marsh. It's my job to advise our clients on all aspects of risk management, but today we're talking about operational risk in terms of potential harm to primarily probably your employees from members of the public in terms of workplace violence and aggression. My background prior to joining the kind of more formalized risk management world was I was a regulatory and civil defense lawyer for several years, dealing with all manner of public liability, employers' liability, and road traffic claims against large organizations. So a lot of this comes from that perspective of the kind of the legal lens. Now, what I've done in the time available to us today is I've essentially split the topic down into 4 key areas. So it'll be quite high level. I am absolutely happy to take questions at the end. And as I said, I've had a previous life in litigation, so I'm always open for a bit of robust discussion on things. So please do feel free to sort of query anything I've said or ask for clarification on things. Anything I don't get time for, I'm more than happy to put a response to you all after the event if I need some time to go away and think about my answer. But essentially what we've done is we've split down to 4 topics. So we're looking at, what is it that we're talking about? What do we mean by violence at work? Which I think is important that we understand what incidents violence at work can encompass, who's been affected by it. We have the why. Why is this a problem for us? If a member of the public is causing a problem, why is it not a problem for the police? Or is it not an issue that they should face alone? And then what can we do about it? Because in some cases, depending on the industry, it is very tricky to deal with the threat of violence, especially when it's third parties outside of your control. And whilst today has been branded up as retail and logistics, I hope to include some examples, and I hope some of the advice will be equally applicable regardless of industry sector. I think the risk is variable depending on which sector you're in, but I think the control measures broadly align. And as I said, I have some examples of cases that have been in the public domain across a number of industries that I'll refer to throughout the next hour or so. So in terms of what is it that we're talking about with harassment, aggression and violence, well, I've sort of worked from the definition from the HC report, which is referenced in the link down the bottom of this slide. You can see the front cover of it there as well. So you're more than welcome to look at this report yourself. I would recommend that you do so because it's quite brief. It's very clear and it has some really good offering of guidance again of what you can do around it. And again, the lawyer in me would say it would be very beneficial that should you be looking down the barrel of a regulatory or civil lawsuit, you refer to the fact that you've sought guidance from this document and sought to apply its principles. There'll be further documents I refer to during this talk as well, where exactly the same applies, showing that you've looked at the industry or safety industry standards for these and sought to apply those to your business will always put you in good stead when evidencing your approach. And again, just touching on that point, my experience from in practice was largely my clients fell foul of regulatory or civil interventions, not because they had done the wrong thing, but because they failed to evidence the route that they'd taken to get to their actions. So it's a bit like back in school when you had to show your working. There would often be an allegation that you hadn't done something appropriately, or you hadn't made a decision with due process, and being unable to evidence the process you went through to make your decisions was often what caught clients out or proved that they had taken certain steps. And it was one party's word essentially against another, with an employee saying this simply wasn't done, the training wasn't provided, against the company saying, well, it was, but we can't prove it. We haven't got the documentation, or the documentation isn't detailed enough. So again, I would bear that in mind when referring to some of the material here about how you can introduce that into your organization and demonstrate that you have done so. But returning to this particular document, we're essentially looking at kind of two limbs, despite the three elements of harassment, aggression, and violence. Harassment in the document is defined as occurring when somebody is repeatedly and deliberately abused, threatened, and/or humiliated in circumstances relating to work. Now, if you look at an analogy with the civil law in the UK, the Protection from Harassment Act, that also talks about a course of conduct, which essentially has been defined in law as any more than one event. So this does not necessarily need to be a sustained campaign of harassment. And I'm thinking in context here, potentially between employees, not just members of the public towards an employee, but if an employee has a disagreement with a manager, and after even more than, I think, just one event, essentially anything more than a single event, there is potentially the risk of that employee being able to start to form the basis of allegations of harassment, because it becomes a continuous course of conduct, effectively. And like I said, the other point to bear in mind there is that in terms of what constitutes harassment, it's based on would a reasonable person view this as harassment. Now, I am sure you have seen in the press various, usually it's employment tribunal cases being reported on where someone has claimed for harassment or has claimed for discrimination, and usually you see some sort of comment that the manager, in being accused of this, has dismissed those concerns as being, oh, it was just office banter, it was joking around, they fully engaged with it, the usual platitudes, this kind of thing. And of course, that often falls down because, yes, the manager may see it as all a bit of a joke and all a bit of fun, but if the individual person does not enjoy that joke or is forced to play along because, again, office politics or workplace politics dictate that they have to, but a reasonable person would look at that and go, that's not funny, that's not a joke, that's not to be taken lighthearted, I could see how that would be seen as oppressive conduct and would cause that person, upset, then that's where companies get themselves in trouble. So again, that's the harassment side of things. The violence is when, again, defined in this document as when one or more workers or managers is assaulted in the circumstances related to work. Now, I'm happy for someone to find where I've missed it, but I couldn't see a definition of assault in the document. But again, leaning on my civil law experience, the tort of assault and the tort of battery, which are civil actions that you can pursue a claim for damages for, assault is the threat of violence, the imminent threat that you are going to do harm to someone. Battery is the actual contact. So again, to give you examples from kind of other fields, assault can be feigning to throw a punch at someone. That is assault. Although no contact was made, that is the threat of immediate violence. The battery doesn't need to be a heavy-handed punch. It can be any unwanted contact. And you often see battery cited many years ago a lot in medical negligence cases where someone did not consent to a medical procedure. The doctor has then executed that procedure. The tort is battery. You have not done me any violence in the terms of, what we would normally consider this, the throwing of punches, but you have laid your hands upon me in a way that I don't consent to. And again, it can happen in sexual assault cases as well. If it's not as in the criminal sphere of that offence, but if it's unwanted contact or touching, it creates the potential for the civil claim of battery. So again, I would probably be minded to apply that sort of definition to the idea of assault in the workplace, again, to err on the side of caution. And the reason I think it's important to know these definitions is to make sure your workforce know what to report and what is not acceptable. We'll talk about it on the forthcoming slides, but there's a huge problem with underreporting. Again, we'll talk about the British Retail Consortium surveys on the statistics here. And whilst the numbers are pretty shocking, I'm under no illusions that they're probably massively underrepresenting the problem of workplace violence, particularly in the retail sector. And the sad reason for that is people just don't report it. They think it's part of the job, or they don't realise it's triggering one of these offences. Think, oh, well, they shouted a rude name at me, or they threatened to hit me, but because they didn't actually hit me, it doesn't count. Well, that's wrong. These definitions are pretty clear in my view, with the exception of the extensions that I've applied to them. But I think, these are events that I would want my workforce to know about as being obviously unacceptable, and they should be flagged to management, be it from a member of the public or certainly from a co-worker, for further action to be taken. They shouldn't be told this is just part of the job. And I'm sure none of you do that as health and safety professionals, but it can be that culture that we want to sort of work against in a way. And the reasons, again, will come into the why we focus on this, though, a bit later. But the reason why it's important is that, we don't want to have to work in that environment. And you can't fix a problem you don't know about. If you're getting a completely clean sheet across the board with members of staff not reporting assaults or violence or harassment that is going on, you don't know to take further action to resolve it. And what can happen is, it remains a under the surface problem. Something catastrophic happens and a claim or a regulatory prosecution is brought, and then all of a sudden a number of other employees in the organization chime up with, yes, this has been a problem for a while. We've either not said anything or we've said something and been ignored. And line management haven't understood that if something like this happens, it needs to be addressed. So that's why I think it's important to understand definitions and ensure your employees understand those definitions and what they should be notifying you of. And again, I mentioned this about the British Retail Consortium Crime Survey Report. Again, link is there for you to take yourself to it, and I recommend that you do. It looks at broader retail crime, not just violence, but we'll focus on just the violence part at the moment. But again, pretty damning studies of how many of these incidents occur a day. Looking at 21 incidents a day of violence with injury, 104 a day of violence without injury, so pretty unacceptable. But unfortunately, the reality of what a lot of our frontline and usually public facing employees are facing, I think certainly heightened, and I think the report alludes to this, as a result of COVID. And there was some specific calling out of the enforcement of mask mandates, which again, I know from my retail experience has been a particular flashpoint. And we've seen it in the press where, let's say, supermarkets have applied a mask policy. And again, maybe down to training, maybe down to a lack of clarity about what the procedure should be. An attendant at the store has tried to enforce this policy. I know a lot of, certainly the larger supermarkets, actually backed away from we want you to wear a mask, but if you're not wearing one, we're not going to challenge you for this to avoid the very problem we're going to talk about. But in the case of where that's been misunderstood, there's been a challenge, and the retail employee has wound up with themselves being threatened or otherwise actually, assaulted and battered under the eyes of the law, as a result of the perceived third party's audacity to challenge them over a mask. And there has been a number of, as you've seen stories in the media, there's been attitudes of certain figures that have not helped that position, because it has given some people who wanted to fight back on this issue the grounds of legitimacy for doing so. So again, people have felt particularly militant over this issue. And like I said, it has been a well-documented flashpoint in public-facing roles, and it remains a very difficult area for certainly some of my public-facing clients to deal with, because then on the one hand, they wanted to comply with government regulations on mask wearing, but on the other hand, they don't want to put their staff at risk. So I said, well, a lot of, anecdotally, what I saw was a lot of supermarkets in particular, but also the bigger retailers saying, we would like you to wear a mask, but then when it wasn't complied with, there was no enforcement, which again can put them in difficult position. But that was the compromise they came to. Now, what could be seen as a positive note in that whilst these assaults were up, the number of prosecutions increased massively, implying that there is government action in the form of police intervention being taken on this. But I think the sad reality is the number of prosecutions is up, but if I've understood the BRC stats correctly, and as they try and point out in their report, the prosecutions are up, but then so were the offences. And unfortunately, actually, as a proportion, the successful prosecution figure dropped. So I think it was something like, whilst it's doubled to 19,000 in previous years, it would have been around the 8,000 mark. But actually, that represented 8% of incidents being prosecuted. You double that to 19,000, it sounds like it's getting better. But actually, as a result of the increased level of incidents, the prosecution rate has dropped quite dramatically. And again, I can't say I'm particularly shocked by this. We all have seen, I'm sure, again, the reports in the media on the issues around resourcing. And again, there's not exactly been a huge amount of additional resource gone into law enforcement, whilst, as I said before, as a result of the last 2 years of COVID, we've seen this problem explode and become, significantly expanded. And, the armchair psychiatrist in me says, we're going to see it get worse. We're in very difficult macroeconomic conditions. I would suggest that the British public psyche collectively is more on edge than it was, say, 2 to 3 years ago, maybe down to financial pressures at home. And again, as you would imagine, particularly, again, I'm leaning on retail again heavily here, but in the retail environment, the spectre of shoplifting increases in an economic downturn. So again, that potentially increases the number of potential flashpoints. So this is a problem that sadly is not getting any better. And the BRC have been extremely vocal on this point, and rightly so, trying to make sure that it remains in public focus so that action is being taken about it. Now, in terms of who is at the highest risk, it probably won't be shocking to realise that the protective services occupation, so police officers, are obviously at highest risk. They put themselves in harm's way more often than the average member of the public or the average employee. So it makes sense that they would be a higher proportion of those stats. But again, if you then look at the second, third, and fourth, it's health and social care professionals. Again, not to legitimize it in any way, but not surprising, because some healthcare professionals will work in certain fields where the service users they work around are more prone to violence. But again, it reflects what you may have seen in terms of reports and focus on tougher sentences for those that assault blue light operators. So again, there have been numerous stories about ambulance crews, fire crews, finding themselves coming under attack when they respond to emergencies. And as distasteful as that is, it is the reality of things. So again, I wasn't shocked to see them kind of second in place after the protective service. And then you come in with, I'll lump these together, managers and proprietors, which, you took as potentially restaurant owners, fast food franchise operators, that kind of thing, and sales occupations. So everything in retail. Again, heavily public facing roles. But again, what I'm conscious of is the logistics part of our of our remit today. Again, doesn't surprise me that there will be a high proportion of logistics operators, I think further down in the stats, for a number of reasons. Some of them, including that, open themselves up to the risk of harm by dint of what they're carrying. Some of them transport high value merchandise. If you're driving an articulated lorry loaded with the latest Apple iPhones, there is an incredible risk of hijack. And again, the kinds of individuals who are involved in that more organized element of crime will not necessarily be averse to using violence to achieve their ends, or at least the threat of violence to achieve their ends. But also, in the more sort of smaller last mile type delivery operations, I don't think there has been as large a problem as there could be in this area, but certainly the idea of assaulting a courier to get to the contents of their van, knowing that there is in all likelihood some high value items in there, is not outside the realms of possibility. So again, I wouldn't like to see that, or infer at any point that this risk is limited to the professions highlighted on this slide. This just represents from the BRC's survey, the highest ones that are being reported. And again, there's a link to the HSE statistics on that down the bottom if you want to delve into that in a bit more detail. So turning to, now we've done the what, it's the why next. So why, sort of being a cold-blooded lawyer, only caring about the money and the compensation, obviously, why do we care about this? Well, you're all safety professionals, so I won't lecture you at length on the moral duty. You will know that from your own IOSH and IOSH training and your own personal experience, no doubt trying to convince senior management of why health and safety is important. But, in brief, the desire to keep your employees safe and that societal expectation. You should not go to work in the expectation you will suffer harm. That is unacceptable as far as society is concerned, and rightly so. The other risks that are coming in now are brand and reputation. So some of you may be involved in your own organization's environment, social and governance efforts. And again, it's becoming a huge focus, particularly in anything public facing. The idea that you want to be showing your credentials as being as ESG friendly as possible is, again, right to do. I'm glad to see that is coming through. But obviously, if you are trying to demonstrate that message, and at the same time, constantly there are stories in the press about your staff being assaulted and then not supported by the employer, you're going to struggle on probably the S and the G side of that, the societal and the governance side, by showing that you're not looking after your employees, or you're potentially putting in the members of the public at risk as well. And we'll talk about that when I come on to the next slide. And as I said there, the potential media attention, there is certainly, in the case of a prosecution, very little to stop a media organisation picking up on this and dragging your organisation's name through the mud, even if it's only by proxy. And there has been a case against a large supermarket last year where she was the victim of the story was a few years ago, I should confirm. She was the victim of a serious assault, and very sadly passed away, but sometime after the initial assault. But the two were eventually linked, saying that had put undue stress on her. That had obviously caused, I don't know the exact details of kind of the medical condition, whether it was a PTSD-like condition or simply the added stress and anxiety having been in that situation. But again, it was linked to, certainly the family wanted the known that it was linked to that initial assault, and the supermarket in question, I would have suggested, got some reputational damage as a result of that, because they were made out as not having done enough to protect that person's position. So again, the potential there for there to be severe damaging brand and reputation damage is there, as well as a concern, and things that I would be using to leverage to the stakeholders in your organisation of why this is important, why we need resources to deal with it. The next part becomes recruitment, which again, I keep referring to what's going on in the media, but it really is just such a useful bellwether. But you must have, you'd be I'll be very surprised to see that if you failed to see reports of how hard it is to recruit in a lot of frontline jobs at the moment, be it logistics, retail, hospitality. There is a dearth of talent at the moment in this industry, and people are very prone to move jobs. There's a lot of flexibility amongst the workforce that they can hop about as they wish and please. Now, obviously, if someone joins your workforce and within 2 or 3 weeks is getting a barrage of abuse on a daily basis from members of the public, I know I wouldn't like to be there for much longer, and I would start job hunting straight away. So that actually causes severe operational stress on the organisation. So it not only causes harm in terms of, especially with today's internet culture with things like Glassdoor, they will leave reviews saying, I've had a terrible experience, I'm not supported by management. That will put people off applying. And of course, you will have the flip side that as people leave, you will suffer gaps in your rotas and whatnot, and sort of almost perversely probably put other employees at further risk of harm. Because as you can imagine, if you're in an environment and you have a number of colleagues around you, you're safer than you are if you're working on your own, hence all our protections around lone working. So it can actually exacerbate the problem that you start to get people who are on skeleton shifts who then become greater targets for aggression and violence, because usually the kind, the aggression and violence, the perpetrators of it are emboldened where they feel like they're not outnumbered, and there is going to be no backup, in almost a bullying mentality of, this is an easy target, I'm not going to get much comeback from this because there are people around to help them. And then we come into my world, which is, if the first 3 aren't a sufficient carrot of why we should do it for the nice reasons, here's the stick, which is the law will come after you. There's a good chance the law will come after you. And there's a couple of cases here where there has been a civil case. Collins and First Quench Retailing was a civil case where the allegation was the employer failed to put sufficient measures in place to prevent harm coming to employees during the course of robberies. And there was a history of robberies at the retailer, and the employer was able to show basically no lessons had been learned and gained significant compensation as a result. Similarly, in Cook and Bradford Community Health Trust, same sort of case. Again, allegations around failures in training, risk assessment, and safe procedures to be put in place. It's also worth noting that when I was putting this together, I did focus very heavily on the risk of violence to your employees from members of the public. But there has actually been a couple of high-profile cases where it's been the other way around, and employees have, for whatever reason, actually assaulted members of the public. Now, whether they have been provoked or not, or whether they have somehow had a relationship outside of work that has led to that, obviously the law is pretty objective on this and thinks, well, that's not a problem. There's no excuse or defense available to you saying, well, this was an altercation that resulted from something outside of work. It's if it takes place in connection with their work activities, the law's pretty clear here on vicarious liability, that you as the employer can be on the hook for this. And the 2 examples I'm thinking of, these are publicly documented cases, but I won't say names, just to make sure I keep myself clean on this. But one was a major supermarket. It was a petrol station attendant. A gentleman had entered the petrol station and made a rather unusual request about trying to print some documents off. What then became even more unusual is that rather than respond simply with a no, the attendant has then engaged on what was, I think, described as a sustained campaign of violence against the individual, which continued out into the forecourt. And the individual, again, sometime after the initial incident, passed away. Now, I believe that was unconnected to the assault, but it obviously complicated matters. And it remains a little bit of a mystery as to why the attendant acted in the way they did. But you could look at that objective and say, well, surely that is so far removed and so unpredictable as to how would you find any fault on behalf of the supermarket. But the courts initially disagreed on that and said, no, the original interaction arose as someone coming into the petrol station and requesting support or assistance. It absolutely came out of a workplace interaction. And that's the kind of danger that employers are open to if one of their employees does react in such a way. And again, what can you do? Well, practically, really, it's all about training and discipline, which we'll come on to in the later slides. But that was an unusual case, but one that has stood out and was well documented in the legal community as being one of how far does vicarious liability go? And the answer is pretty far, unfortunately, for employers there. Other examples have been, again, the nighttime economy, unsurprising, has been a flashpoint for a number of incidents, but there was a very serious incident a while ago, again, well documented, where an altercation outside a nightclub between a doorman and a member of the public eventually escalated into, I think it was the member of the public returning with a knife and doing serious harm within the club, and again, serious injury occurring. But again, nightclub found itself on the receiving end of a civil suit for the way and its connection to the door staff. Again, the interaction had arisen out of a kind of a workplace activity. The customer, or the individual, sorry, member of the public, had been a customer of the premises before being ejected. And then it had escalated. And then even though the person had returned home to collect a weapon to return again, none of that broke the chain of causation. So again, some really, really long and, long causational kind of issues here, but the employer finds themselves potentially exposed to this. So again, when we come on to what can you do about it, being able to evidence you put these procedures in place can be incredibly important, particularly given the weight of which the regulatory environment can put fines on you now. Again, I'm sure you're well aware of the new sentencing guidelines. I still refer to them like that to my clients, but the sentencing guidelines that came out in 2016 now allow absolutely, in my view, catastrophic penalties to be levied on organisations that breach even just Section 2 and 3 of the Health and Safety at Work Act. We're not just concerned with corporate manslaughter anymore. It's actually the more bog standard offences that can trigger the largest fines. So turning again to kind of a secondary source of information, again, I've referred to the BRC report and I've referred to the HSC report earlier in this. There's also a HSC document, INDG 69. And again, I've sought to summarise that just with 4 bullet points here, but essentially it's that kind of methodology I alluded to before. And I'm sure you've all seen Plan, Do, Check, Act in your careers as well. And this is a version of that. But do you have a problem? Do you ask, or have we got our heads in the sand? So, are staff aware of what should be reported? If they do report it, do you treat it like an accident? You would do a thorough investigation, you would get witness statements, and you classify incidents on basis of severity, so that, again, we understand what the patterns and trends are. So if you've got a particular location that seems to be flagging this up, does that location need reviewing from a security point of view? If it's a particular route for your delivery couriers, do we get to the point of saying, do you know what, we just can't deliver to this postcode anymore? It's too risky. There's been too many assaults on our staff, or there is a lack of protection. And I'm using extreme examples there, but what protection do we take, or what do we do? Do we double man up to make sure that no one is sent alone into these environments? Because again, the evidence shows us there is too great a risk of harm. Once you've done that kind of fact finding, obviously you decide on what action you will take. So, good old-fashioned risk assessment techniques here. Who's going to be harmed and how? You evaluate the risk. Is there training that could be provided? Could you improve the environment some way? Is there something about the job design, as I mentioned? Could you double man up a single man operation for particularly challenging areas or particularly challenging stores, and increase staffing and security for them? And again, crucially, as the lawyer in me, record those findings. Make sure every process and every step of this journey is documented in some way. So if you're having meetings where you decide what to do to review risk assessments, have a meeting minute. Show that it was given sufficient time, proper consideration. Things were not just done off the cuff. Things were certainly not done because they were the cheaper option and no one wanted to spend more money on security. If there was a good reason for it, and there's a good case where, again, the courts went into the detail and the organisation was demonstrated to have fully accepted there was a risk, have looked at the alternative, what you could do, have dismissed those alternatives because they just would not have improved it. The court was then able to find in their favour when someone was alleging we should have done more. The court said, well, they didn't do what you wanted, and I get that, but what they did was reasonable based on their own, they assessed the pros and cons of it. In terms of taking action, obviously implementation of guidance and training, and I'll talk about some of these other areas of it more in the how in the next couple of slides before we wrap up for some questions. And then obviously your last stage is checking, consulting with employees and their representatives. What's the mood? What's the feeling? Do they feel like they're getting a number of these incident work and nothing is happening about it? Again, the report talks about considering a safety committee. Most organisations I work with, they have some sort of safety committee already. So making sure that violence is one of the topics that's under consideration being on there, at least on an annual basis, I would suggest. And again, minuting those meetings. And again, the records and the incidents, it all works on data. The best organisations I work with from a claims and regulatory point of view, they are gathering as much data as they can so they can understand the problem. So, now that I've talked about all the grim stuff and all the problems in the world, here's where we come to, what can we practically do about it? And no one is expecting you to 24/7 guard the safety of employees. Again, you're safety professionals, you know that. You have to do what is reasonably practicable. So I've tried to think of some practical things that I would like to see organisations point to in the event that someone presents a claim or a regulatory prosecution potential against them, say, well, this is what we've tried to do. And the first parts, and these are all really simple to implement in my view. First part is there is materials out there. So the National Business Crime Centre has produced this poster, a lot like the standard Health and Safety at Work Act poster, that talks about what is it that's going to happen if you ring the police and report a violent crime. And again, my experience from frankly dealing with the police, and certainly from representing clients in police interviews rooms, familiarity helps people get more comfortable with it. So if you're telling people, as it demonstrates on the poster, which I've replicated to the right here, what they're going to get asked on the phone and what information they should be able to provide when they make that phone call, I think that helps the process. It helps people engage with it. People might not want to ring the police or ring, a telephone number if they don't know what's going to happen. They think it's going to be complicated, or I think they're going to get asked difficult questions they don't know the answer to. If you know what's coming, you're usually more comfortable with it. So this poster goes some way to doing that. So displaying that in a break room or on a notice board or communicating it via email, depending on your setup, I can't see how that would do any harm. And there is a link to it there. As I said, it's a third-party source, but I don't see any problems with communicating that to your workforce. I think it starts at the very lowest level. What can we start doing about this? Further resource that I'm all in favour of, again, completely, as far as I can tell, cost-free, but the BRC, in partnership with the Susie Lampner Trust, have produced a really good, I really like it, a short YouTube animated video, and it talks about, it's aimed at the retail environment, but I honestly would stress to you, this applies to all other environments as far as I'm concerned, dealing with where there is the potential threat of a third party inflicting violence upon one of your employees. I just wouldn't, it could apply to estate agents, again, picking on the Susie Lampner existence. I've seen it apply in school environments, education environments, where teachers may have to deal with disruptive pupils. Retail, we've touched on. I think logistics, if one of your colleagues is approached and threatened, I think it applies to any industry. But essentially, it goes through nicely and gently kind of each of these areas about dealing with theft, obviously a bit more particularly to retail, but dealing with angry customers or an angry individual, and antisocial behaviour, again, what to do in terms of putting yourself in a safe position. Talks about your need to develop proper response plans, and how those who benefit from being in an environment covered by CCTV can add protection for themselves. Fairly common sense advice, but get yourself in front of a camera, make sure the third party knows they're on camera. Again, it's like, people are emboldened when they don't think they're going to get caught or they don't think anyone's watching. If you point out they're on camera and just saying, look, this is all being recorded, everyone's seeing what you're doing right now. If you walk away, then that's the end of it potentially. But if you go any further, then obviously it could be resulting in a lot of problems for you. I've talked about this in usually in a road traffic context with some drivers where they've been involved in a road traffic accident, and because I work with a lot of commercial organisations, they often have dash cams, and I've said to conduct all your conversations in front of the vehicle, if it's safe to do so, bearing in mind passing traffic, so you're on camera. And that protects you, because again, you can point to an angry third party, look, this is on camera. You might want to just moderate your conduct a little bit, just to make sure that you don't come across on the footage as poor. But it also actually protects drivers. I've seen it in a couple of cases where third parties have alleged drivers have acted unreasonably and said they were aggressive or oppressive, and we've reviewed the footage and found no evidence of such thing, nothing about violent body language or threats or anger. The driver has been cool, calm and collected. But a member of the public has decided to allege that because it might, or in their view, might put their claim in better stead if they try and allege that the driver's at fault. It's always a bit tricky going to court when your witness has been painted out as a bit of a monster and there's no evidence to dispel that, particularly if your witness doesn't always come across very well. So, good use of camera equipment wherever possible. It talks a little bit about body language recognition. So what can employees do to put themselves on notice? This is a conversation that's going sideways. And of course, de-escalation tactics and diversion methods. Really effective ones that I like are, showing empathy to the individual if they are complaining about something and getting very animated over it. You understand their problem, completely get it. I'd be just the same if I was in your shoes. But I don't have power to do anything. But if you ring this telephone number, or you email this person, or you contact someone, or you let me go away and have a conversation, I can get you a solution. And that does, so it diverts by saying you need to ring this number. I've seen that used in retail quite a lot. Or if I can go and get someone, it gets that person to go away and then have the safety in numbers of having someone with them if they need help. We don't want individuals being cornered in isolated environments. Again, the kind of the experience of this shows that that's when there is a higher chance of something horrible happening to an employee. So again, nice little advice around that. And I would suggest that would form a really good little toolbox talk to issue to employees and say, look, I need 10 minutes of your time. Let's go through this. Make sure you've seen it. Any questions, any observations, any feedback? Can we do anything better on this? and then there it is, you've got your evidence, some sort of documentation that this has been shown to everybody, I think would go a decent way to showing that you've done what's reasonably practicable. And then, training and support, obviously, policies in relation to violence and aggression, both internally and externally. Obviously, I mentioned this right at the start of the talk. You absolutely don't want management staff acting in a way that your more junior staff find oppressive, or potentially the basis for harassment or even actual violence. And again, some of the cases I've looked at have involved, intra-colleague violence, where two colleagues have not got on. And one particular case, again, was a retailer where I believe the problem, unfortunately, lay in deep-rooted religious differences. And I suppose a nice way to put this is nationalistic tendencies, I suppose, which resulted in one worker being very much against the employment of another worker and making their life pretty miserable up until eventually it led to an actual assault and battery occurring. But again, the complaint against the employer there was nothing was done. And this person was well known for their I suppose anti-minority views, I suppose is the best way to put it. But management just didn't want to tackle the bull by the horns, and eventually those views spilled over to actual violence against a minority employee. But again, strategies make it clear to the workforce, anything like that, not tolerated. It'll be straight into a disciplinary with a rigid disciplinary process to back that up, working closely with your colleagues in HR. That needs to be in place. One point in particular that was raised recently with me about the logistics industry, entry to third-party residences, which is a tricky one because in certain areas of deliveries, you will be expected to. If you're moving heavy furniture, I can see you getting bad Trustpilot reviews for not helping get that furniture indoors. But I think a clear policy on what your employees do and don't do is important. Again, for two reasons. One, protects your employees going into a residence which could be entirely it is entirely outside your control and may contain unknown risks or severe risks that you know about and aren't willing to tolerate. And again, it protects your employees from having homeowners allege things against them, even if it's just as innocuous as property damage. But if they're not crossing the threshold, they're not putting themselves at risk either. They're not putting themselves at risk of an allegation because they remain in public view all times. They're not doing things behind closed doors that they then get accused of, conduct that would be viewed dimly by the public if they learnt of it. Look, I'm not suggesting that's always practical for every industry, but I know there are certain industries that say we don't let people cross the threshold, but our drivers do it anyway because they're pressured to. Well, actually, if your driver say, look, I'm really sorry, but for various reasons, I'm not allowed to do that. I can help in any other way, but I'm not allowed to come in. It's to protect me and it's to protect you. There's been a couple of stories in recent months about fairly horrendous dog attacks, and that seems to be rearing its head again. I think it's, I dare say, me speculating here, but a hangover from 2 years of lockdown where a lot of individuals went out and got themselves a companion and they got dogs, and some dogs require more training than others, and if you don't train those dogs, they can be unpredictable. But there has been a number, particularly around certain breeds, of very serious incidents where people have not controlled their dogs, and that's what I'm thinking of, especially in terms of things like the post office has run huge campaigns, Royal Mail have run huge campaigns on alerting their residents, I suppose, on their delivery routes about the need to try and make sure their dogs are kept away from their post men and women or post officers, because of the number of dog attacks and dog bites and whatnot that have occurred to them. Again, routinely putting themselves in harm's way, having to enter people's properties, the external areas, I mean, rather than internal areas, but where dogs are often found out in gardens, out in front yards, that kind of thing, and the dog reacting poorly to someone they see as a threat to the home. So again, consideration, I think that to me at the moment, when I'm talking about entering people's properties, I think that's the biggest risk. I think the odds of you being assaulted, thankfully, are pretty low. The odds of you receiving a dog attack are pretty high. And again, I know particularly one industry was a estate agency. There was a nasty story recently where an estate agent had found themselves trapped in a house with a dog having suffered an attack. And then the owners, for reasons I probably will never fathom out, wouldn't let them leave the house. And that was obviously a particularly unpleasant scenario for that individual. And eventually a neighbour had to prevail upon them to get them released from the house from the homeowner. So again, quite scary circumstances. But I've mentioned that in my next point, pre-delivery animals. Can you do anything on pre-delivery checks to say, look, if we're delivering a wardrobe, what's access like? How many people in the house? Any dangerous animals? That kind of thing might be something you consider. I'm not saying you have to, but maybe something to think about if practical. Again, reasonably practicable measures, isn't it? So we have that. Listen to your employees, always a good one. They are the ones on the front line. They're the ones that experience it. If they've got any bright ideas, why not bring them into the conversation? Again, I am a huge fan of anything involving the risk assessment or training process to have some evidence that employees were consulted. A lot of the problem I saw a lot of time was risk assessments and training documentation being written in isolation. In the ivory tower of head office, we say how the job should be done. but I've never done the job, or I haven't done the job for a long time, and I don't appreciate there are subtle nuances that will result in that risk assessment being ignored or the training method not being followed because it simply does not work in the real world. That is when you get into real problems around tolerated breaches. You write a great set of policies and procedures. If they bear no resemblance to what's happening in reality, then the courts will give you no credit for them. Loan working, of course, suitable risk assessment around that and robust procedures. And again, the HC website has a huge amount of support and policy guidance on that. Technology, I have seen a number of devices out there that send alerts when someone becomes immobile after a certain period of time or fails to check in after a half-hour window or whatever it's being set at. I've seen that used a lot in the kind of the land surveying industry, where you might have people going out to large open tracts of land. It can be something innocuous like they immobilize themselves by falling over and hitting their head, or falling down a mine shaft or something, that's almost like kind of a natural peril. But again, the alert goes off when that person doesn't move after a certain period of time or doesn't check in when they should. Again, same idea as when checking vacant property. If they disturb someone who is there who shouldn't be there and they become assaulted and they get assaulted, again, same idea, sometimes with an inbuilt almost panic alarm to raise the alarm preemptively. And then I've said legislation as a question mark. There was a huge push a few years ago from, I think it was a Scottish MP, to kind of expand the blue light punitive element of prosecuting these individuals, to make it, an aggravating feature of any offence to assault, I think it was retail and hospitality employees, because the rates were so high. And I think the intent is admirable. I think the impact is limited. I think we've had that aggravating feature against blue light for donkey's years. You saw the BRC stats for 2022, healthcare professionals still up there as the second, and police force still up there as the first. Now, I guess, as I said, they may put themselves in harm's way, admirably, because it's part of their job to do so. But it clearly hasn't dissuaded the public that this is unacceptable. If you do it, you're going to get hit hard. And the realist in me thinks only, unless you had the absolute harshest of sentences, very few people are thinking about, what sentence am I going to get if I lamp this shop worker? They're thinking, I'm angry. Their focus is on their rage and their aggression at that point. I think you can have the harshest legislation, just shy of life imprisonment. I don't think people would be necessarily factoring into their decision. So I'm not convinced legislation is going to add an awful lot, other than, I suppose, a retroactive feature to get justice for victims. At least they will see perpetrators, when convicted, getting a sentence that is commensurate to the crime. But again, as you've seen there from my earlier slide, the prosecution rate is still woefully low, and I doubt anything's going to increase that anytime soon. So I'm not holding my breath for any legislation suddenly changing this picture. And I'm conscious I've got about 10 minutes left in the talk, so I will wrap up there. But I'll sort of offer one more kind of line of thought, which is, if you found this useful, or you found that you want more detail on this, you're also more than welcome to reach out to myself and just have a discussion on what else could be done, bearing in mind the particular nuances of your own businesses. I'm happy to have that conversation and answer any questions you may have. I'm potentially bring some of my safety colleagues in if needed, and security professional colleagues in as well, if required. But after that, I think that is that is the end of my talking for the hour. I've got about 10 minutes for questions.
Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation, Alastair. It was very informative, very thorough, going through the who, what, why, and how features of this excellent topic here. So we do have some questions. The first, it would be interesting to hear your views on the traction of the PCSC Act 2022, the crimes against retail workers.
I think I touched on that at the end. Basically, the stats bear out that it hasn't had a huge difference. I mean, it was still early days, right? The Act was 2022 dated, so it's maybe too early to call it. But I just don't see offenders in this area thinking, doing the rational, what does the law say on this before I lash out? They're not thinking about the consequences of their actions. And I think if you look at the BRC stats, the BRC website just says this is getting worse, it's not getting better. And as I said at the end there, I don't think the solution lies in the legislative approach. I'm all in favour of being done in parallel, but I don't think that's what makes this problem go away. I think the as much as there is a solution, and actually I should stress there is no silver bullet, but as much as the solution to keep your people safe it lies more in the training side, the de-escalation. How do you get people out and away from these scenarios and equip them with the skills and abilities to remove themselves from the situation? And even with an act that came in that was phenomenally successful in terms of the punishment side of things, this is all retrospective. Someone has still been assaulted by this point. To get a prosecution, someone's been hurt. And whilst it would be fantastic to see them get justice, you can't get away from the fact that they've still been hurt. And ideally what we want in the safety profession is the reduction in the likelihood of harm as well as the potential impact. But the likelihood is where we should be focusing.
Okay, thanks for that. Another question, have you ever experienced a scenario where staff members have ended up carrying their own weapons for protective measures? And if
No.
so,
Yeah, sorry.
And if so, what happens or what would happen in those scenarios?
So no, that's an unusual one. I would say it would depend on the weapon. I think generally you'd find yourself in hot water. I mean, particularly if we go to things like carrying bladed articles, there are very clear laws on what you should and shouldn't carry. There is no statutory defense around, well, I'm carrying this weapon for my own personal defense. That is dare I say, an American idea of carrying concealed weaponry for defense reasons, or sometimes not concealed weaponry for defense reasons. We don't have that here. I would heavily caution against that. That to my mind, the word arms race comes into it. If you arm your shop workers, my view is that those who would come in with the intent of doing harm will come equally armed, and quite frankly, it's an arms race you will probably lose, because if it is a criminal element, they're going to be willing to go further in that than probably your staff are, and whether you are as an organisation. I would certainly heavily caution against any sort of arming of your employees. I presume that we're talking at the more innocuous end, so things like pepper spray and things like that. I think that the potential for it to escalate far higher. I would leave things like that to the professionals. It's more about, I think, as I said in one of the slides there, your employees should be getting away, getting safe, not escalating this, if that makes sense.
Okay, thanks. We have a comment from Tony Page. He said that we have security who work on university campus, so have to deal with lots of ASB, but are also called to student accommodation to deal with numerous incidents. So unfortunately, we sometimes have to end at third-party residences, and we have body-worn cameras for use, and sometimes not used all the time.
So that's fantastic to hear. Obviously, body cams, you have seen, again, I'll lean on the US market here, but sometimes damning, sometimes exonerating footage from law enforcement officers about what the situation was they encountered. But I would certainly have that as a protection, both against harm to secure a conviction if one of your security officers is assaulted, but again, protection against unfounded allegations, or potentially evidence the allegations was founded, allowing you to take swift disciplinary action if that camera footage, well, depending on what that camera footage shows. I think the only thing I would suggest is, and if practical, is if a officer has to enter a residence, is there a way he could radio that in to a central call centre to make someone aware he's going into a residence, and then if he doesn't call back in 10 minutes, to send in the cavalry or something like that, just to make sure that nothing can happen to that individual whilst they're away from, again, potential public lines of sight. But even that, I think that to my mind would be easy. But again, it's if you've got the resources for it and if that would work. But I can't see that being overly onerous to implement. You may be doing it already, of course.
Okay, thanks. Sandra Gavaya asks if there are any additional considerations that you would be able to share if those members of the public involved are underage individuals.
So I'm relying on the statistics released by the BRC. I don't think they break down the perpetrator by age, but unfortunately, I've got nothing further on that in terms of the demographic of these offenders. I'm trying to think, potentially UK crime statistics might give that out, but again, I've got a feeling that they would probably look at violent incidents, not necessarily in a kind of a retail or employee environment. And I won't defame any particular age group by saying it's this particular group that causes the harm without any data to back that up. So I'm sorry, I don't have that information, but it would be an interesting one to see where that's coming from, see if the demographics are changing at all. Is it becoming an older group or a younger group? I don't know on that front.
Urtaza Kamar asks if you can please further elaborate on risk profile work location based on crime data and ensure suitable staffing.
Yeah, so I've seen this where some retailers, when they're looking at new sites for a location, there's publicly available, I think it's just called crime mapping, there's publicly available crime data available that gives you an idea of, so last time I looked at this a few years ago, pre-COVID, and it was around burglary. And one of my clients, we were just using it as the basis for kind of a security review of their premises. And we as part of that report, went into the publicly available information and sort of as a bit of background said, actually, they're in a pretty low area for commercial burglary. So that's good. It enhances their risk profile, bearing in mind that a lot of my role ultimately feeds into the insurance industry, and insurers will provide coverage for theft and damage to premises as a result of these crimes. So that's why it was pertinent. We wanted to make it clear to insurers this was a low risk environment. But again, it's what I said sort of earlier on in the slides. The more data you've got, the more informed decision you can make. And I'm not saying that if you suddenly find out it's in a high crime area, that you can suddenly, again, you've got a silver bullet to do something about it. But I think being able to demonstrate you've taken that in consideration. So let's say you do look at it somewhere and you think, let's face it, we're down to the kind of final site selection for a new store or new location, and one of them is coming out very high on the crime map. Maybe that should just go into the pot. There could be a lot of other reasons that point in its favor, but if that is a major detractor, being able to demonstrate that we've taken those crime statistics into account and as a result, potentially increased security, either that's physical or manned security, so more CCTV, bigger fences, different cash handling procedures. And again, one of my retailer clients has done work around this where they've made sure that there is robust CCTV about anything where cash in transit may be dealt with. Again, making it very publicly clear that that is in place as well. That can be used to, I suppose, to use the security parlance, but harden the target a little bit to make it less of an easy go. And look, the brutal reality of this is you don't have to be Fort Knox. You just have to be more secure than other alternative targets that criminal individuals may target, right? They go for the lowest common denominator. If they know your store or location has poor security, low staffing, poor perimeter security, you're an easier target than someone with all of this in place. You don't have to be the top of the class on this. You just have to not be at the bottom, I suppose, on that front. But again, if that factors into your decision, great. I am trying to reflect commercial realities. Might be, look, we need a location. Unfortunately, it has to be in this area. It has, an unenviable crime history because of it may just be in a very busy urban area, and a lot of the city centres of the country, they do have high crime stats because there's a huge population density there. If that is unavoidable, fine. But again, showing it's gone into your consideration about what do we do in terms of, do we put screens in the stores? Do we have an extra security guard on? Is the security guard 24/7? As long as it's being, at this point, show you're working. That's what's important to me, I think, there. Your ultimate decision may not be challenged. The court might go, I wouldn't have done that, but you did it taking into account the right information. We've just got slightly different risk appetites, essentially. I'm okay with that. You haven't been negligent in not applying your mind to it or trying to cut costs in doing so. I hope that makes sense, but that's sort of where I was coming from in terms of it just being another tool. And again, because it's free and publicly available, there's no real drawback to doing it. I wouldn't like to be asked in the witness box, why didn't you avail yourself of this easily obtainable information? Could you have done it? Yes. Was it reasonably practicable to do so? Of course it was. Right. Now you're in difficult water because there was a reasonably practicable action looking at this information you did not take. Any other questions at all, Ria?
Yes, we do have a few more. So Kevin Agius asks, would you consider conducting a psychosocial risk assessment at the workplace as a basis to determine the extent of harassment and bullying on the mental health of your employees as a good practice?
So I think that would be very thorough. I can't say I have a lot of clients that do it, but I do think, as I said in the slides, I think how you do it is sort of up to you, but making sure you're aware that there's a problem by asking that question. And you could just do it through a very simple workplace wellness survey. I'm quite happy to say I work for an employee that every year asks us a number of questions about sort of how happy we are in the workplace. And it talks about, do you feel supported by your manager? I think, anything that just teases that out, I think can only be beneficial in terms of gathering the information. I say that with complete reality that not every organisation has the resources to run these things. So I would not like to hold out saying by not doing it, you're opening yourself up to significant risk. But I think if you had the resources to do it, and it can obviously be done confidentially and sensitively to the data you're collecting, it would give you that information. It would potentially tell you about a problem that you didn't otherwise know that you had. And it feeds in nicely to another area, and again, something that Marsh do a lot of work on around mental health and well-being. this is obviously a huge focus at the moment, and supporting employees with these types of issues, mental health and wellbeing type issues, is seen as a major benefit, and actually almost, I dare say, becoming a standard expectation of employees. You know, certainly the law, you'll all be familiar with the Health and Safety at Work Act, I'm sure, it says you're obligated to take, essentially look after the health of your employees under Section 2. It doesn't say physical health, it says health. So to my mind, that clearly includes mental health, and to the HSE's mind too. So demonstrating you've made inquiries of this as to what is it like, what is being done, could we be doing any better? I think, again, all goes as a positive to also looking after the organisation in terms of claims and potential prosecution on that front. And I will just say, what I'm hearing anecdotally from my colleagues still in practice, the HSE are definitely looking at mental health more now. They haven't in the past, but they're certainly looking at it now. It wouldn't surprise me to see a few prosecutions come through in coming years for companies that really have fallen far short of where they should be.
Okay, so we'll squeeze one final question in before we close. Yuko Emmanuel asks, do you think that our prosecution process and sentencing laws may be contributing to the increase in aggression and violence against protective service occupations, which then translates to the attack on retail officers?
I don't know if it's necessarily a cause. It's like I said before, I think the correlation between what the law says and the level of, and the offences of this nature, like I said, it just comes down to that cognitive dissonance that someone is not, I think, thinking about the consequence of their actions when they perpetrate these crimes. I keep going back to the fact that I remember, and I'm sure, again, those of you that are aware of, that follow the press, there was a huge song and dance about, again, attacks on blue light staff, and rightly so. These are people who have voluntarily put themselves in harm's way. That doesn't mean they should suffer it. And they try to keep us safe, and they try to keep us healthy, and they try to stop us from burning to death. Talk about the fire, ambulance, and police services here. And the idea that someone would then go out of their way to deliberately provoke or attack them, I find, I'm sure we all find morally abhorrent. But despite the toughening of these laws, it still happens. We've not suddenly seen these individuals go, well, actually, now it's a bit rich for my blood. I'll go on to, I don't think that necessarily pushes it downhill into I'll go and beat up some retail employees instead. I just don't think the stick here of the criminal justice system is putting these people off, because I don't think they're acting in that rational mindset when they perpetrate these crimes. I think, again, it remains of, and also I'm conscious of my belief in life is, what can I control? And I can't control what the punishment is. I can't control whether someone gets prosecuted or not. I can try and provide evidence, but if the CPS say there's not enough to continue, or the police don't want to know, I can't necessarily push on that. What can I do to keep my employees safe? I can train them. I can make sure that it is crystal clear. They are my priority. If someone comes, if you're delivering a package and someone says, hand that over, or there's going to be trouble, you hand it over. The package is insured. You are, the package is insured and probably replaceable. You are not. It is not worth getting stabbed or anything like that, over what is essentially material possession. And I will say, unfortunately, particularly in retail, it's not just the actual initial injury. This is grim as it is, the initial weapon of choice in retail is a needle. So you're not just talking the physical injury of a stab wound, it's the potential infection wound as well. And lo and behold, that is, I understand why perpetrators who do this kind of systematically, they choose that weapon, because it infers that kind of fear. I would want any retail employee to know, if someone comes to you with that kind of threat, they can help themselves to the store. That's all insured goods, as far as I'm concerned, or goods that the retailer has already allocated for stock loss. It is not worth someone getting seriously physically harmed over. So yeah, as I said, and I'm labouring my point here, but I think that the legislation, has it contributed to pushing it downhill into retail workers? Maybe, but I can't see any evidence for that. I think it's more just the fact that, as a society, unfortunately, we've all been under huge amounts of stress and pressure over the last 2 years for lockdown. Now it's turning to macroeconomic factors, and people who are probably on edge about something, they're lashing out. They're lashing out with completely misdirected violence. They're angry at something, but the retail worker or the police officer or the ambulance crew member or the delivery person, they're in front of them right now. And if they cause that flashpoint, unfortunately, they will bear the brunt of it. As I said, that's why this de-escalation of, I get where you're coming from, I'm completely on your side, but you don't want to be angry at me. And I really like the retail example that I was given a few years ago, which is, here's a telephone line to our head office, shout and rant against them, because the worst that can happen there is you smash a telephone up, but you can't punch me. You can be as angry as you like on someone with the security of being on the end of a phone. I know it's not pleasant for them, and I'm being slightly hypocritical. I'm saying that they then bear the brunt of the verbal assault, but I'd far rather have someone verbally assaulted than physically assaulted, frankly, if I'm going to have to deal with this environment.
Thank you, Alistair. Unfortunately, we're out of time for all the questions that went unanswered. Alistair will get some responses to you and we'll have them posted. So thank you so much, Alistair. This was an amazing presentation, very informative. Thank you, everybody, for attending. Have a great day. Take care. Bye.
Thank you all.